My name is Laura Garcia. I'm the Training and Support Manager at First Draft. That's how you can find me on Twitter. And we're joined today by Claire Wardle, who has been a leading figure in this kind of space for a really long time and is basically amazing and an expert, and you are incredibly lucky to get to ask questions of her today. You can also find her on Twitter. If you're going to mine, you're going to get more cat-related content sometimes, so apologies for that. A little bit about First Draft. We are a non-profit that works with journalists from all over the world to do research and think about our relationship to truth, to social media, to disinformation, and how we can work collaboratively to make sure that we produce credible coverage. And we've got a ton of free resources on our website that are available for you guys to access. And I'll walk you through a couple of our latest prides and joys related to coronavirus. This afternoon's session, we have three main goals for it, or we hope that by the end of it, we've all learned at least three things. First one is to understand the impact of the infodemic, how it is affecting different people and how we are seeing this online. Number two, to remember the power of visuals. Sometimes it's really easy when we're talking about information to think about just as text and facts, but how the images that we share with each other and that we produce add to the overall narratives of how we experience the infodemic. And the third one is how do we talk to other people about coronavirus, whether it's friends and family, or maybe that one person who keeps putting like problematic content in your group chats. How do we start to have more productive conversations rather than just mute each other and draw lines that separate us? If anyone's joining us on the call who is a working journalist or a reporter, or you just have an interest in this kind of stuff from a more journalistic point of view, we've just launched a free online course dedicated specifically to the challenges of covering coronavirus, everything from how to identify the different types of disinformation that we're seeing online, how to find them, how to monitor, how to verify content, and then how do you report on it, right? Because we have to consider the whole process of producing journalism in order to have a more complete answer that newsrooms and journalists can action on together. So if you're interested in that, you can go online to covid.firstdraftnews.org. All you have to do is create an account, but it's free and helps you track your progress. It's made to be bite-sized, so you don't necessarily have to consume the whole thing from start to finish. You can dip in and out to what feels interesting to you. All the videos, for the most part, are really short text to read, because we know nobody's got time, even though we're all stuck at home. And I'm going to hand you over to the incredibly capable hands of Claire to walk us through how we are seeing this infodemic play out online.
Thank you, Laura. I don't know why you're being so very nice to me today, but I appreciate it. So we wanted to kick this off by having a conversation about the infodemic, which is the term that the WHO used in February to describe this. And sometimes it gets discussed as all of the false and misleading content, but actually it's just the overwhelming nature of all of the information that we're seeing right now. And partly it's the fact that what we know is changing so frequently. People want facts, but actually if I look at fact checks back in February about whether or not to wear a mask, back in February I was told not to wear a mask. So understandably, people are really confused. And in that confusion, we have kind of information gaps and vacuums. And because there's uncertainty, it's being filled with conspiracies and other types of information. And that's why we wanted to do this webinar today to say, yes, journalists have got a really important role to play in pushing out quality information. But we also have to be honest that in many countries, up to 50% of people are not really engaging with professional media. And in those spaces, they're turning to one another. They're turning to other sources of information that aren't necessarily pushing quality information. So we actually are now at First Draft turning our attention to say, how can we work with the public? How can we work with communities to ensure that actually all of us take responsibility for what we're sharing? And I think one thing I'd say is sometimes when you say to people, don't share misinformation, they're like, oh, no, I'm not sharing misinformation. I'm just posting to Facebook. Like they don't see the posting of information as anything they should have responsibility around. And one of the reasons that we put visuals into this webinar is because people don't take memes seriously as information. And it's really part of this mess. And so this slide is a kind of a representation just of the social media channels where people are seeking out and finding information. So Laura here is an avid TikTok fan. there are a lot of conspiracies circulating on TikTok right now. And so to dismiss that and to ignore that as a source of information is actually not something that we should be doing. Similarly, Instagram, a very visual platform, there is, you know, content on there that is pushing conspiracies and false information. Reddit has some great forums with scientists sharing the latest studies, but even in those spaces, if you as a member of the public doesn't understand what a preprint is, doesn't understand that it hasn't been peer reviewed, you have people sharing information as fact, not understanding that it was a very small study in one small hospital in one small part of France. So all of that means that we've never had so much information. People are consuming more news and information and social content than ever before, but we have to recognize that not all of that is quality content. Can I have the next slide, Laura? And so we also have to recognize, this is what we call the trumpet of amplification, which is if I'm a conspiracy theorist and I spend a lot of time in a conspiracy community, I don't have a huge audience. And the only way that those conspiracies become dangerous is if we see them move up the amplification chain. So if we see bigger communities resharing it, we then see celebrities or politicians resharing it, and then we see the mainstream media reshare it. That's what we have to be careful about. So when people say, oh, I'm just sharing it with my friends in this group, what they don't necessarily understand is it's moving up the chain and it's potentially reaching different people. And let's also be honest, journalists are monitoring how much of this is being shared to get ideas about what they should debunk and what they should cover. So if they see lots of people sharing conspiracy content about 5G phone masts, they're going to say, okay, well, we need to cover that, which you could argue they should do, but it's kind of been taken out of their hands by that point because so many people have been sharing it. So it's really important when we talk to people about this, that they understand the kind of the dynamics of the information supply chain. We talk about the supply chain for grocery stores. We also have to understand how that works in this information space. So as we talked about, social media is a real challenge. This is one of these conspiracies we've been talking about, this idea that 5G phone masts are actually spreading coronavirus. Something like this, you know, gets painted onto a shed. Well, only the people walking past that shed would normally see it. The photo gets taken, it gets reshared and amplified, etc., etc. So we have to understand again how all of this is being amplified and shifting from platform to platform. So something might get taken down by Facebook, but you can still find it on Twitter or Reddit or YouTube, etc., etc. So the challenge here is it's whack-a-mole on steroids right now. Next slide, Laura. And so on this question of amplification, this is a Daily Mail story in the UK, but we could have seen examples like this from almost every country in the world, which is asking a question as a headline, which allows journalists to say, oh, I'm just asking the question. But if I don't read all the nuance in this page, all I see is somebody making the suggestion that maybe the virus leaked from the research lab in Wuhan. And the problem with all the conspiracies about the origin of the virus is we don't have the origin story. Right now, there's so much confusion about where did it come from that the absence of clear information is what's causing these conspiracies to move around. So having newspapers cover this, which I understand why, the challenge is how do you cover it in a way that doesn't actually reinforce or give oxygen to very niche rumors. And ultimately, this is about sowing distrust. Too often people say, oh, you know, disinformation, that's about persuading people. It's really never about persuasion. It's about sowing distrust in sources of information so that people don't know what to trust anymore. So this is a really upsetting story from the BBC about people of colour in the UK checking themselves out of hospitals because they had seen rumours suggesting that doctors and nurses were treating them differently because of the rumours and conspiracies that were circulating about communities of colour in the UK. I mean, we are seeing real world harms from this. And I think that's critical when we talk to our friends, our family, our communities. We can't ignore the fact that these kind of rumours are starting to have real world impact. And ultimately, if people start saying, I don't know, can I trust the BBC? I don't know. I think, you know, BBC, that's fake news. You know, oh, I can't trust the WHO. You know, I've heard that it can't be trusted. It's China centric. Oh, you know, I can't trust the Epoch Times, which you can't trust. But the more we have these conversations about you can't trust, unfortunately, we could be in a situation where people are turning away from these kind of authoritative sources and they're turning inwards to one another. And that's where we're going to have some concerns. And ultimately, these are some polls that Laura pulled together, but we're seeing more of these now in different countries, which is the number of people who believe some of these conspiracies is actually something that we can't really dismiss. So people who said the coronavirus is a man-made epidemic, 14% definitely true, but 35% of people saying probably true. I mean, these numbers are not insignificant. The last one, the threat of the coronavirus is being exaggerated for political reasons. I mean, this in itself is really interesting and goes to say again, if you don't think the media is covering this well, if you think your government isn't responding well, you have people who are going to pull away from these sources of information, which is going to be so worrying when it's a time to say, no, we actually have to extend the lockdown. If people don't trust the information they're getting about that, they're more likely to go outside. And the other thing we have to stress is that the kind of rumors and conspiracies about coronavirus are sitting on top of existing very well networked communities online. So for example, the homeopathic communities are pushing these kind of, this is a site called Nourishing Traditions, but these are the types of people that say you should put an onion in each corner of your room, or if you gargle with salt water for 10 seconds, you'll be okay. So we also have to understand that there's already a foundation of these networks who are pulling out the bits that support their existing worldviews and pushing them to their communities who are already susceptible to those kind of messages. So we can't see coronavirus in the absence of all of the other types of disinformation or existing rumors and conspiracies that have been around for a long time. And so of course the vaccine piece of this, we in the US are tracking the lockdown protests right now. And not surprisingly, many of the groups that are pushing those protests are connected to the existing Second Amendment gun rights groups and also anti-vaccine groups. So one of the things I'm really, really concerned about is if we're lucky, we might have a vaccine in 18 months. But what I see is 18 months of this kind of drip, drip, drip of anti-vaxxers pushing this idea that we can't trust vaccines. And poor Bill Gates, who's got caught up in all of this, and is currently funding 7 labs to work on 7 different vaccines. The conspiracies that we're seeing around Bill Gates are so worrying, where people are saying he's going to microchip us. You know, all of that stuff means how likely are people to take the vaccine when we get it in 18 months time? And right now, a recent New York City survey said that 38% of New Yorkers would not take the vaccine. Well, that's already a high level. So the thing we need to be concerned about when we talk to communities and we talk to our friends and family is to understand that right now it might seem like a funny meme about Bill Gates, but ultimately, what is that drip, 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 drip going to do? And I think sometimes we look at this stuff in isolation, like, oh, well, that piece of content isn't that problematic. What we don't know is what's the cumulative effect over many months. So that's the kind of laying out the infodemic as a kind of an explanation of why this stuff counts. But does anybody have any questions or even comments about things that they're seeing in their communities? I'm going to ask Laura, because Laura is actually from Mexico and she is in many family WhatsApp groups. And I'd love to hear from you, Laura, like, how is this playing out in Mexico? Are some of these conspiracies also things that you're seeing?
Yeah, so like everybody, I'm in 500 different family and friends WhatsApp groups, and it's interesting that I see a bunch of these same ideas or problematic content travel to my family WhatsApp groups in Mexico. So for example, one of our colleagues is from Ireland at First Draft, and he shared with me a funny meme, and then 3 days later I got the exact same thing from my mom. So a 30-something-year-old Irish man is sharing something with me that's taking 3 days to travel across the ocean to my 65-year-old mother. And it's across languages and it's across countries, but it speaks to the same kind of stuff and how it travels so quickly, and how the reasons why people will buy into these different theories are a little bit different. So I was just discussing with another colleague at First Draft, for example, that there is already really high opposition to some vaccines in Mexico because the way the HPV vaccine was introduced clashed with kind of like Catholic cultural values and what the church was saying and how it was introduced to schools. So already people have a preformed idea of why vaccines work or don't work or why you oppose them. So these new ideas of, well, when we get a coronavirus vaccine, is it going to be effective? Should I take it? Will I have any side effects? Well, maybe it works, but it causes this. Or they have a right place to start off with. And it'll change from country to country, but Mexico particularly, for example, there's also high distrust of the government and corruption. And a lot of those theories start to fall into that place of like, well, obviously they're putting together a vaccine because everyone's stealing money in government and the labs are in on it and they want you to not know. And the, people will have legitimate reasons. And Claire will talk about this later on about why they believe or participate in these communities, but they seem, I'm finding it incredibly similar. What my friends in the US are sharing, what my friends in the UK are sharing, what my friends in Mexico are sharing. And it's 3 different countries with 3 different cultures and a couple of different languages. And this stuff just spreads, right? But what is the central theme of it all is that we're all seeing it everywhere. Everyone is getting tons of messages on their phone, on social, watching the news. We're all stuck at home. We have nothing to do. And that desperate need to say, where do I go? How do we talk about this? And what can I actually do to feel a little bit of control is consistent throughout.
No, and that word control is so critical that we often, dismiss people who believe in conspiracy theories. But the reason that conspiracy theories are so powerful is because they're a simple narrative. And we know as humans that storytelling is at the heart of how we make sense of the world. And actually, complexity and nuance, which is often the way to describe something like coronavirus, we don't as humans respond to that as well as one simple narrative. So it was, created in a lab as a bioweapon. Oh, okay, yeah. Because actually, and again, as I said, we don't have the background. And I also thought your point about countries that have high levels of corruption and distrust in the government is critical, because I would argue, I'm British, I live in the US, and in those 2 countries, we don't often think about corruption, or we don't necessarily, we've had normally relatively high levels of trust in governments. And I would say the handling of this crisis in both of those countries that was late and people are angry about that means that the kind of people are in many ways mirroring maybe some countries where they don't have the same trust in government. So there's going to be really interesting research about all of that. So there's some other great questions coming in. Somebody asked for the survey around New York, and I will try and Google for that whilst Laura is doing the next section. There was a really great big question, which is like, how do we fight disinformation? And I might leave that till the end because we're going to touch on some of those things. But just to say, there is not one simple solution. There are things that the platforms need to do. There are things that governments need to do. But I would say in the last 3.5 years, we haven't talked enough about the ways that people themselves are part of the solution. It's this like, oh, well, ultimately, everybody else needs to make a change. And if we as society don't say, this information pollution is not going to go away. Like, our reality is that we will constantly be wading through information that's true, false, and a lot of gray. And the only way we get through that is by taking responsibility as ourselves to not share false and misleading content. But we haven't done enough to, I don't think, hold each other account. Doesn't take the pressure off the platforms. They absolutely need to do something, but it's a great question. And then somebody's got this question about kinds of messaging. We're going to talk about that in the 3rd section, but this is a great question about targeted ads. It's for many nonprofits don't have the money to spend on, for example, Facebook ads. The platforms are giving away more of these ads for like Facebook and Twitter if you're doing media literacy messages. I would love there to be more research about the effectiveness of finding communities who have believed in certain things and pushing messages. But lots of academic research says you need people from within your community to be the messenger. If I wade into a conspiracy theory and say, hi, I'm Claire, I've got some great information about labs in China, nobody's gonna be like, oh, thanks, Claire, for joining. They're gonna, basically harass me out of the group. So what we need is more peer-to-peer messaging, as opposed to believing that, well, if we have more mainstream media, we have more fact checkers, that's gonna work. But we will talk a little bit more about that in the 3rd section. Oh, and Laura can talk about Spanish speaking resources, maybe at the end when we get to the resources section. And Damon, hi Damon, he's one of our fellows, is asking about there are states in the US like Florida or Colorado who are described as purple states because they're a real mixture of Democrats and Republican. And the challenge there is, of course, coronavirus is now being politicized. So if you want to reopen the economy, that is a position that the Republicans are taking. If you want to keep the lockdown, that's a position the Democrats are taking. And so unfortunately, this story, which is a health story, is now becoming a politics story, because in the US there is a big election in November, and because of that, this story is playing out through political lines, and that's very difficult because people don't want to trust messages that go against their political worldview.
And across the pond, we're seeing that same thing politicized in terms of Brexit. So it's what the UK wants to do in opposition sometimes to what the EU wants to do. And I'm sure these dichotomies play out in different parts of the world in different ways.
And this is a great, somebody has talked about a project called resistcovid.com that's in the chat, which I had not heard of. So I'm excited to check that out. But thanks for the great questions. I think we're going to move on to the next section, and we're going to have another space for Q&A after that. But Laura, take it away.
Right, guys. So I want us to talk and start to think about images and the power of visuals, because as Claire mentioned, the only way we're going to beat this is that everybody starts to own their own agency in spreading this information. And too often the frame around disinfo has been focused specifically on news. And this is more. This is about all the information that we shared, conveyed in all sorts of different formats, whether it's a funny TikTok, which I'm a big fan of, or a meme, or a screenshot of a messenger conversation, or the images that we see being shared on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all the different platforms that we're on. And the first thing, obviously, typically that we've started to see is these images of the reaction towards the pandemic, right? And don't get me wrong, it's a scary situation for all of us to be in. We all have to be aware of the dangers, but the more of the imagery that we share that is framed around panic, the more we get that idea in our heads, right? In this kind of contagion style image. We even saw that on Twitter, a couple of frames from that film with Dustin Hoffman, Contagion, being shared on Twitter like if they were real, because they fit into this same narrative and this same frame of panic, right? And the problem is, when we're afraid, we don't make decisions here. We make decisions here. And those images add to that slow drip, constant narrative that we build together. It's not just the mainstream media, but that we build by the things that we share with each other and that we expose each other to. And the same thing goes for behaviors, right? So this has happened in waves in different countries as the disease moved on. And I saw it, for example, hit Italy, and then in the UK, and then my friends in the US, and then my family in Mexico, where because we were all posting and sharing images of empty shelves, everybody went out to panic buy. So we made it worse. We triggered a self-perpetuating cycle of, well, obviously you're not going to find anything at the shops because we're all making each other scared and we're all going out to buy stuff. Whereas if we'd all just kind of only gone to shop out once a week, which is kind of what you need at this time, nobody would have had to wait in line. The shelves could have been restocked. We would have given shops time to bring out their inventory. And it's about thinking, can we change that narrative, right? And this doesn't mean we have to change the story. The story still is what it is. But can we make sure that the information that we're sharing visually as well reinforces good behavior so that we keep each other safe, right? So this is from a guy called Rodri Marsden, who's a music producer in London. And he tweeted out and saying, why aren't people sharing pictures of the stock shelves when they actually go out to buy? To remember and remind us all that if we all just stay calm and keep our distance and do our shop calmly, we actually can find food and we're all going to be okay. And this is an image that Claire stumbled across on Twitter about how people were social distancing, waiting in line to get into Trader Joe. Trader Joe is a shop in the US. And again, just reminding us, this is happening and it's part of our new reality. We're not going to sky away from it, but reinforce what we share helps us reinforce good behavior and clarity at a time when all of things are really uncertain. And so, for example, in this weekend where the beaches in Florida were open and then everybody flocked to them, or there were a couple of different protests, thinking about how those images also add to that same sensation. And I don't know if you guys also saw particular images coming out of Israel where they had a protest, but they were socially distancing and everyone stood exactly at the right distance apart, and how you can combine those two. As much as our lives and how we take our lives on board have changed so much because of coronavirus, there are still ways to do things in a way that is socially responsible, that keeps us all safe, and that follows the scientific guidance as we know it now. To Claire's point as before, this guidance will change as we know more, because that's just how science works. It takes time for them to understand new diseases and what we're supposed to be doing. and we can help make sure that that information is at least as clear as possible. The other thing that we shouldn't forget is memes. We've already talked about them, but again, just because it's funny and it's easy to share, maybe this is the first Bill Gates and coronavirus vaccines meme that you've seen, but by the time you've gotten your 20th, or you've gotten a meme and you heard it on the news and then your friend told you about it and your mom shared a screen WhatsApp and you saw it in a private Facebook group, it starts to stick. Repetition makes things stick, right? Or it makes it easier to believe further down the line. Like Claire says, this is a long game. This isn't things that happen and change overnight. It's about sowing that doubt throughout the months that we can then find problematic afterwards. And to remember as well that images can not only carry with them ideas of what we should do and how we should behave, but also stereotypes and preconceptions, right? The virus might have started in China, but it's obviously a world problem now. And the amount of news outlets and memes and people sharing images that only use people who come from China who are wearing face masks. There was a previous story that we shared of the lab of whether the virus came from China, and you see some Chinese scientists wearing face masks doing experiments. Again, we can reinforce these stereotypes in a way that actually has real life consequences, and memes play into it. So I got this, for example, through my family WhatsApp. And it's funny, and people can laugh and say it's funny, and we're all going to say, oh yeah, but I don't believe it. That other people are racist, and Claire will talk about third person effect and go like, oh yeah, but I'm not going to buy into it. We are building these narratives together. Every single thing that we share with each other is a small little act of publishing that builds this stronger overarching narrative that we need to take collective responsibility for. And we've seen already how this has real life impacts. So there's been a spike in anti-Chinese sentiment, both in the US, in the UK. This is from Ireland, for example. And not just that, particularly, for example, in the UK, there's been different ideas and conspiracy theories shared on WhatsApp groups about how people who are Muslim are going to enforce public Ramadan to try and get everybody else contagious. So we've seen a spike in Islamophobic attacks and Islamophobic behaviors online, because these things travel, right? They might live in your phone first, but they eventually become offline behaviors that we all build together. Any questions so far? Oh, Claire, you're muted.
It isn't a webinar if somebody doesn't say, oh, you're muted. So, so I'm just going to say the thing about memes too is that they are dismissed often by researchers as being frivolous, but they're actually like jokes. We call them like nth memes, which is in order to make sense of a meme, you have to understand the cultural reference. So that one with Yoko Ono, if they were not John Lennon and Yoko Ono and they were just people of different ethnicities, your brain wouldn't have to make sense of that. But you have to say, who are those people again? Oh yes, she's of Asian descent. The joke is he's wearing a mask because, and I know I'm just spelling that out, but in the same way as a joke isn't funny if you don't understand the underlying premise, it's the same with memes. They're often a nod and a wink to cultural references or films. And so actually it forces our brains to do more of a leap to make sense of them, which is why memes can actually be more effective vehicles of disinformation. So that's why we take memes so seriously. But in terms of some of the questions that people are talking now, there's a great question here about best practices journalists can use to inform communities that fall into news deserts. And certainly it's very distressing right now to see local news outlets have to furlough their staff or have to lay staff off. And I think the reason that we wanted to have this webinar is we can no longer just assume that journalists are the only gatekeepers. You know, I think that we should be working with religious leaders, other forms of community leaders, other forms of educators, to find a way to try and push out these like quality information, particularly in spaces where we have fewer journalists. And so I think in many ways, newsrooms don't often, excuse me, want to connect with community groups, but actually right now, I think we have to build those relationships because ultimately we need to reach as many people as we possibly can. There's a question here about sharing information during a chaotic time. I mean, the truth is that we've never really had a story of this scale that we knew so little about. And so I heard somebody talk, which I thought was excellent, which was we should be thinking like crisis communicators right now. So rather than say, this is the definitive answer about, you know, whether or not the disease is airborne, we should say, this is what we know right now. But as more data emerges, as we do more research, this might change. And I think, you know, over the last 4 years, science and expertise has had a bad rap. And many people said, we don't need expertise. Everybody's an expert. And I hope that the coronavirus has made people realize that we do need scientists, but we also can't pretend that science knows everything from day one. And so I think we should, you know, we should be having much more thoughtful conversations about how knowledge emerges, how we learn, how research gets replicated. So I think this point about how do we talk about antibody testing, you know, 3 weeks ago, the UK government was spending millions of pounds on buying antibody tests. This weekend, they said, oh, that was wasted money because the antibody test doesn't work. Like, we just have to be much more realistic with our readers and listeners to say, everything we know right now could completely change in 2 weeks' time. And that's difficult. It feels like we're on quicksand. And at a moment when we're so scared, it's difficult. I think we just need to be much more honest with the people who are consuming our media. So it looks like there's some interesting stuff being discussed in the chat. But should we move on to the next section? Because I'm aware of time, and then we can round up with a big Q&A. So if you have other questions, please do put them into the chat and we'll get to them. So Laura, would you be my slide mistress?
Will do.
So we wanted to use this final section of the webinar to talk about effective ways to discuss misinformation or information in general with your friends, families, colleagues, you know, people that you are talking with. And this stuff isn't necessarily as easy as we think. So one of the challenge here is this idea that friends and family are increasingly moving into closed groups. So in the last 10 years, people have talked about social media being this revolutionary shift. Everybody was talking about everything online, and wasn't it amazing? Well, actually, over the last 18 months, globally, we've seen a shift in behavior. So more and more people are actually sharing information in smaller groups, increasingly in encrypted spaces like WhatsApp, or it might be a closed or secret Facebook group. And partly they're doing this because they are worried about harassment, or they don't want to have a record of what they've said. And so more and more people are going back to these small spaces. It's like a dinner table. It's like going down to the pub and meeting with your friends. But in these spaces, people seem to be a lot less worried about sharing false information. So you probably all know this, is that you get something from your mum that says, this probably isn't true, but I needed to share because I'd feel terrible if it was. And when we do research with people about that, they're like, oh, I'm not sharing misinformation. I'm just trying to be helpful. And so they don't see it as publishing. And so that's one of the things that we have to get people to understand, which is sharing is publishing. Even if you're sharing with a very small number of people, even if you say there's a caveat. And Laura referenced this earlier, but there's a theory called the third person effect, which is if you study media effects, people will say, oh no, I'm not affected by advertising, but everybody thinks that everybody else is affected by mass media. So either everybody else thinks that people are affected by conspiracy theories, but they're not. I mean, I definitely don't do this, but everybody else does. So even having a conversation with everybody else about some of these challenges, which is, you know, actually all of us are susceptible. It doesn't matter how educated you are. It doesn't matter whether you believe in left-wing politics or right-wing politics. It doesn't matter if you're religious or an atheist. All of us are human, and all of us are susceptible to messages that reinforce our worldview. Because if we see something that reinforces our existing positions, our brains are like, oh, I don't need to check that because I already know it's true. And we share it without even checking. And so all of us, whatever our pre-existing views, are susceptible to these types of this kind of misinformation. Next slide, Laura. So something we also wanted to talk about is this theory of the familiarity backfire effect. So our brains are more overwhelmed right now than ever before. We're consuming more information on our phones, on our computers. And because we're overwhelmed, we're looking for heuristics, these mental shortcuts. And familiarity and repetition means if you've seen something before, your brain is much more likely to be like, oh yeah, I've heard that, yeah. And we're less likely to be critical. And so what that means is, even when the news media is debunking something, if we do it in a way that isn't responsible, somebody goes, oh yeah, 5G and coronavirus. Yeah, I heard about that from my mate. Yeah, it's definitely a problem. And even if it's a debunk, if in the headline it simply says, you know, does 5G cause coronavirus question mark, wanting you to click, you're like, oh yeah, because my mate told me that last week. So we have to be really careful because of this familiarity and repetition. And again, we should be talking to each other about this. This is not something that just journalists or academics should talk about. We should talk to one another about with how we're so vulnerable and susceptible. And so here's an example of, I mean, this is a group that is based in Europe, and they do a lot of monitoring of disinformation narratives, and they do really good work. But we just wanted to use this as an example to say, please don't do this. And we see this all the time, which is people just listing the falsehoods. Because if this is coming through my feed at speed, and I don't read that top 5 recurring disinformation narratives, my brain is pulled to those top 5. Oh, US created it, EU fails to respond, the coronavirus was probably made by NATO. I know it seems silly, but the way our brains work means that we're really bad at distinguishing what's true or false. And anything that repeats the falsehood, even if you tell me it's false, even if you do that, my brain's like, and I will remember that. And if later I see a conspiracy about NATO and coronavirus, my brain remembers this and it's like, I saw something about this. And that's why we have to be so careful when we talk about this. Wherever possible, we need to lead with the facts. However, caveat, of course, that's so difficult right now because things are shifting. But this kind of image is just not a good idea. Laura. And the other thing we wanted to talk about is this idea of the worldview backfire effect, which is that people process information in biased ways. And as I said, that's because our brains are overwhelmed. And to make sense of it, we are more likely to be drawn to information that we can just fit into our filing cabinet of a brain that already exists. Like, oh yeah, because that's about climate change here. That's about vaccines. And we already have preconditioned ideas about the world. And so we end up seeing new information through those lenses. So when you try and debunk something, unfortunately, people tend to feel threatened if you don't do it in a way that shows empathy and connects with that person. So unfortunately, too often, somebody will post something that's false. Somebody else will say, that's wrong. And here's an article from a fact checker that demonstrates why you're wrong. And unfortunately, if we do that in a way that's not very helpful, it makes that person feel stupid. And it makes people go, well, I really believe that because it sits with my worldview. So rather than read that fact check an article and go, oh, okay, I'm going to change my mind, you're more likely to double down on your existing views because it supports your existing worldview. So what we need to do is to talk to people in ways that are much more open and much more kind of, wow, that's so interesting. I'm seeing similar things in my feed. Like, I really wonder, like, where are these coming from? And, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about these because I'm a bit worried that this is actually going to have an impact on our community. So we should be using words like we, our community, as opposed to, sorry, you're wrong. Here's the proof that you're wrong. So it's subtle, but we should learn the lessons of people who, for example, do conflict resolution. People like therapists. How can we learn how to have conversations with each other that isn't facts are enough? Because unfortunately, people have emotional relationships to information. We like to think as researchers and journalists that people have a rational relationship to information. None of us do. We are humans. The reason that we love to gossip, this is my favorite fact, is that gorillas and apes connect with each other by picking fleas off the fur. Because we don't have fur or fleas, we connect with each other through gossip. So it doesn't matter how educated you are, we connect through those kind of very emotional ways of talking to one another. And we have to remember that when we are talking to one another. And so Laura found this one this morning. So we also have to be really careful that we don't use derogatory language. So here's unfortunately a headline that says, these protesting idiots made Harrisburg the most dangerous place in the state. It can be very tempting to describe conspiracy theorists as crazy, insane. We hear the same language around the anti-vax community. They're utterly crazy. They're so ill-educated. Well, actually, if you spend time in those communities, they believe that people who vaccinate their children are ill-educated. They believe that they're the ones who have all of the truth. So we just have to be very careful in the ways that we talk about one another's beliefs, because so much of what we share is a performance, essentially. Our identity is tied up with this. So you make decisions every day about what to share on Instagram, on Facebook. You're thinking in your head, does this make me look like an interesting person, a sexy person, a funny person, a well-informed person? We're all making those decisions all the time. And so when you say somebody's an idiot, you're ultimately dismissing them and their identity and what they believe. So we just have to be so much better at talking to one another about these issues without making it personal. Because when we make it personal, it's not successful at all. So that was a lot of information from us, but we would love to hear any other questions that you might have, or anything that this has prompted, or other examples you might want to share. Oh, this is a great point from Damon. He says, when I talk to my father, I have to approach it as planting seeds versus changing his mind. I don't always follow my own advice. That's great, Damon, because in the same way as we talked about familiarity and repetition, if you were just each time, not saying read this, change your mind, but just each time, just like dropping memes in or information in that has a particular perspective, that's how we should be approaching this, as opposed to believing that one brilliant 800-word fact check is going to do what we want to do. So that's a great piece of advice, Damon. So yeah, please feel free to add any other questions if you have them. Laura, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask, from a newsroom perspective, so if we're talking about journalists working together, which I think a bunch of our audience are journalists or work in journalism, what do you think is the first place to start? Because this can feel like there's so much stuff to do and it all kind of links together and a little bit overwhelming. Where could be a good place to start working together and having these conversations internally in newsrooms or in publishing houses or in schools or anywhere like that?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the things that newsrooms should be better at right now is trying to fill these information vacuums. So understanding the questions that your audience has is critical. So if you're a radio station, what are people asking when you have call-in shows? What's your audience sending you questions around over email? Or, for example, using Google Trends, which allows you to drill down to a particular region to say, if you look at coronavirus, it will show you the questions that people are asking about coronavirus. And you realize, people are still asking questions about how the virus spreads. Well, then it allows you to do reporting that fills some of those gaps, because it's the gaps that's causing the conspiracies to flourish. And so I think we need to first figure out what audiences are asking, then do reporting that answers those questions, and then think about innovative ways to push that information out. So is there a way that some of your most loyal audiences, can you make them kind of information volunteers? Can you say to them, hey, we'd love your help to try and push this stuff out to all of our communities? Like, I think we need to be better at recognizing that not everybody is engaging with the mass media, and how can we ensure that the quality information is circulating, not just the conspiracies. People are sharing in WhatsApp the conspiracies and the misinformation. You don't normally see people sharing the quality information. So how can you become like a curator for your community? I heard somebody say the other day, oh, there's a guy on my street who I don't really like very much, but now every morning he posts in our Facebook group some of the best reads from around the world about coronavirus, and it's so helpful. And I was like, wow, like he's playing a role as a kind of an information gatekeeper for his community.
We've got another question, Claire. It says, how to kind of leverage your idea. It's not that black and white. I'd love your thoughts on quickly crowdsourcing veracity score from experts.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see, and I think this term experts right now, how do we ensure that we are talking to the right health experts? And ultimately, I heard a doctor from Harvard saying, I'm getting 200 emails a day with reporters asking me exactly the same questions. So I think when it comes to that veracity score, I mean, it's hard. If we're talking about new research about the vaccine, you can't really have a veracity score, because you need to keep replicating that same piece of research to see whether the same results come back. If you're talking about veracity about a conspiracy theory, you can say, well, actually that got a -100 veracity score, but I don't think that necessarily aligns with the reasons people believe in conspiracies. Like right now, they want to feel in control and they want a powerful narrative. So I think this question of veracity score, I know that people want that kind of score, particularly those people who are thinking about AI solutions and technical solutions to this, and scoring makes everybody feel a bit better. But we've tried over the, not we, but this whole community for the last 3.5 years has thought about kind of nutrition labels. How do you give people more information about the source? If you know that this source is only 2 years old, maybe you're not going to trust it as much. If you know that it's been funded by China, maybe you're not going to trust it, etc., etc. The truth is, I know what the nutritional label says about a Big Mac. I still eat a Big Mac. And the reason that people still consume low quality information is because it's kind of achieving that kind of emotional feeling. And so that, it's not that I'm against veracity scores, but I think we need to think about other ways to connect those kind of scores with how we message that, and not just assume that we're all fact-based or rational, because we're not, we're emotional.
We'll go back. There's a follow-up question to that we'll get to in a second. And thank you for making me extremely hungry, Claire, referencing a Big Mac. Got another question about this, the weight that celebrities carry when they endorse an idea or a part of an idea. So for example, they're mentioning that Novak Djokovic is refusing the obligation for a COVID-19 vaccine, saying that it should be voluntary rather than obligated upon people. And this obviously has two layers. One is about like whether you make things compulsory, and the other is about the validity of the vaccine and how these two things can get mixed together, added on top of the power of someone like a sports star or a celebrity or a very famous politician, and how you can leverage that.
No, and this is kind of the $64 million question. It doesn't matter how much we push out quality information via news sources. If you have a celebrity push out a conspiracy, that has huge impact, not only huge reach, but also many people have this sense that they kind of equate celebrity with, they have extra knowledge or they have access to more information, so they must be more informed. But we see huge damage being done by influencers pushing out false information. Again, I think it goes back to, how do newsrooms think about reaching different communities? So should they be partnering with YouTube content creators? I mean, is that something we could do? I mean, ultimately, what Novak Djokovic is talking about is saying, can we be more, can we have more transparency around the vaccine? And actually, can we allow people to be uncertain and to be, you know, I think we have to also recognize this. If we don't understand and hear these conspiracy theories, then we're going to be in a worse problem. There is a reason that people don't trust vaccines. And for example, one of those reasons is because people don't trust big pharma, because they've seen big pharmaceutical companies make huge profits from people's health. So you can't say to somebody who's an anti-vaxxer, oh no, you're wrong. Well, there is some truth to it. So we actually, if we're trying to have conversations with people about this, we have to say, yeah, I understand why you're nervous. You know, I understand that there are concerns there, but however, can we think about the greater good? Or let's have a conversation about, well, what happens if many people don't get vaccinated for COVID? So in some ways, these celebrities can become a place to like bring these conversations to more people who don't consume mainstream media. But we have to also talk to people about being wary of celebrities. I mean, Woody Harrelson from Cheers retweeted the 5G conspiracy theory 10 days ago. Like, what would Woody Harrelson know about 5G phone masks? But I think we need to have a more honest conversation about expertise and science versus celebrity culture. And unfortunately, in the last 20 years, celebrities have become more influential and scientists have become less so. And I hope that coronavirus might change those scales, because it's a real problem.
And there's interesting examples of the platform partnering with influencers, celebrities like that, that do have some sort of like backing to what they're saying. In the UK, for example, TikTok has partnered with a guy called Alex George, who is actually a doctor, but that's not why people know him. People know him because he was on Love Island, which is this really popular dating show. But because he has that platform and then a lot of people know him, TikTok has actually been sponsoring question and answer sessions live with Dr. Alex George, who is obviously giving people medical advice backed by the NHS with the advice by the WHO. And I think some people are starting to recognize these spaces, but we also need to play a part in reminding ourselves and our friends and family that that's kind of the case. We've got a question from Imran, who I think is running the Resist COVID project. Says, how can we triage information? Well, it is important to help people understand this does not come from a lab. it's practically more important that they buy into socially distancing? And how do you prioritize what information to convey first?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it goes back to this point, which is we've been monitoring these conspiracies for the last 2 months as a team, and a number of these conspiracies we weren't talking about publicly because it just hadn't, we talk about the tipping point, like it just hadn't passed a moment where lots of people knew about it. Then in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a spike in these conspiracies about the origin of the virus. And I think we can't ignore those spikes, because if we don't respond to them, that's how conspiracies flourish. And I'm not necessarily concerned about whether or not people think it was made in a lab or not. I hate that fact, but I'm more concerned that people aren't trusting authoritative sources. But to your point, we do have to push the point about social distancing being important. We have to push the fact that, you know, the virus clearly now we know spreads amongst people who aren't showing symptoms. You know, 3 weeks ago, most people suggested, well, if you've got a cough, stay home, but otherwise you're fine. Like now we've changed that. And so now we have to help people understand that. I mean, I think in terms of priorities, there's, you know, we should be ensuring people's behavior is not going to do harm. So they understand they need to wash their hands and socially distance. But I don't think we can ignore some of these other conspiracies now that have kind of passed that tipping point, because to me, it speaks to people are seeking answers that are not the answers they're getting from their government. And so if you are seeking out these conspiracies, you're less likely to believe what your government says about social distancing if you believe that governments are lying to you. So we have to monitor all of these narratives because they're all playing into, I think, people's behaviors. And, you know, we know this is now going to last much, much longer than we thought. As people stay at home, consume all of this content, if we're not monitoring how people's perceptions and beliefs about different sources of information are changing, I worry what happens when we do need everybody to act in a certain way. And that's why when people go, oh, whatever, Claire, why do you study misinformation? It doesn't really matter. Like, it does matter. And I think with coronavirus, we're seeing some of those real world harms.
I'm going to give us a 5-minute collective warning, you guys. We're going to take one last question. So if anyone's got anything else they want to ask, put it in the chat box. Our lovely colleague Nell, who is the master of all of our webinars, is also going to drop into the chat a link so that we can get some quick feedback from you guys. We'd love to hear what works, what doesn't, what other topics you're interested in, to keep making these webinar sessions better. We're planning well into the next couple months. I just want to say something about, there was a question earlier about resources in Spanish. So our course for journalists, we are getting that subtitled and translated into other languages, and it hopefully will be ready kind of by early May, mid-May. And we've also got a series of these webinars running in Spanish. So this isn't just a country thing. A lot of the communities will be bilingual. So Claire referenced Florida earlier and some of the purple states. In those states, reporters and communicators have a really tough job because these conversations are happening also in 2 languages and in ways that communities communicate in different ways. So I'm doing a webinar with Natalia Gutierrez from ONA Mexico, exactly on this topic, but with Latin American and Spanish language examples in a couple of hours. So 2 p.m. Mexico time, if you want to join in. And we're doing more of these sessions in Spanish. And the resources for our journalist training course is going to be translated very soon. We're working as hard as we possibly can. So fill out, it will also exist in French. So let me see if I don't mess up the languages. It's French, Portuguese, Italian, I'm missing one, Spanish, yeah, and subtitled in English. Yeah, so it's going to exist in 5 languages. Yeah, French. So totally have a look there. The link to my Spanish course today, if you go to my Twitter account at LauraGRB, their link is there to register for our later webinar. And also, you had the same question about other outlets that publish fact checks or debunks or work around disinformation in Spanish. I have made a Twitter list that's called Disinfo Latam that you can subscribe to. And it's a collection of organizations across Latin America and Spanish language media that do this kind of work and journalists who do this kind of work. So you can follow them to keep track of how those conversations are happening south of the border. So from Mexico further down. So please fill out the survey. One last question, if anybody's got, we do a newsletter. There's a question about that. We also got a comment that Steve Curry used his Instagram Live to host a Q&A with Dr. Anthony Fauci. So it's another example of kind of influencers using their platform to spread quality information. Anything else you want to add, Claire, before we wrap this up? Oh, last question. How do we encourage people to return to reading reliable news sources so they have good grounding of info about the virus? That sounds like a really good question to wrap up on. Go, Claire.
I mean, I think we have to talk to one another about the harm that misinformation is doing. And I sometimes compare misinformation and changing the culture around it to drink driving. So 30 years ago, if I went to a party with Laura and she got really drunk, I'd be like, drive home safely. And now I'd have to take the keys away from Laura because it's not socially acceptable to let Laura drink and drive. And I think that with misinformation over the next, I hope 10 years, we will get to a point where we don't think it's okay to just share something on WhatsApp without checking, because I really want people to understand how there is real world harm. And so I think when we talk to one another about this, we say, you know, not only should we not be sharing poor information, but we should help each other find quality information. Like, it should be the sort of thing that in the morning you're like, hey everyone, just saw this, it was really interesting. Like, it shouldn't be nerdy to be following science and expertise and quality information. I think because of the internet, we all sort of went, oh, this is an amazing thing, it's democratizing information. And actually what we need is gatekeepers. We have journalists, they're amazing, but we need community gatekeepers. We need people in different networks to help people navigate information. And I just really hope that as a society globally, we recognize the importance of information, and we don't think that all information is created equal, because it certainly isn't. Oh, librarians, yes, as ever, librarians. Yeah, all of the. I've sort of said to librarians that I wish that librarians had pointy elbows, because I see all these people, you know, getting money and doing misinformation work, and librarians are so lovely. They're just still doing great work in their libraries, but really librarians are the ultimate gatekeepers for communities. So absolutely.
Perfect. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us and for all of your amazing questions. Someone asked in the chat whether this webinar will be available to watch afterwards. Give us a day or two to get it processed, and then it's going to live on our YouTube account, and you can obviously share this with people, friends, and family. We want to be part of these conversations. We'd love to hear your thoughts on our feedback form, or find us on Twitter. We're not hard to find. To hear what you need, what your communities need, what your newsrooms want answered, so we can be as best help as we possibly can. And I don't know if I'm forgetting to say anything else, Nell. You're the one with the wrap-up script.
No, this is great. And from one of our attendees, brilliant and super engaging webinar. So thank you all for being here today. And you can check our website, firstdraftnews.org, for additional coronavirus resources and upcoming webinars.